Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Mark Azulay, and I'm here with Donald Bialkowski, and we're talking about relational leadership. Donald, I'm really happy to have you on the show because your work as a coach and a mentor for men and couples and leaders it's just beating toxic masculinity, right? This entire idea and topic of the show, relational leadership, is like the evolution away from authoritarian styles into, I think, a much more evolved and more effective way of doing it.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah, there's a lot of nuance to the work for sure, and yeah, we'll get into it, I guess. But I'm happy to be here. I'm really excited about the work that you're doing. I'm excited to talk about this kind of work because I just find it so interesting and fascinating and rewarding. So
Yeah.
happy to.
Men need mental health support. I mean, we're in a rough place, and I think like after COVID is now it's more normal, and the stigma is starting to fade, where guys are realizing like, hey, I can actually use some help in this category, in this world.
Yeah, that's one of the gifts of the pandemic, I
Yeah,
think, is really elevating like, oh, mental health support, oh, like good health. So great, let's have that conversation. So yeah, thrilled about that for sure.
yeah. So let's start with the focus on you, Donald. So how do you get into the work? Tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, well, let's see. I mean, I'm a clinical social worker. That's my background. I've been in different mental health and well-being spaces for 20 years. I've taught mindfulness meditation for a number of years. I did psychotherapy. The bulk of my career was at the VA hospital here in Madison, Wisconsin, where I'm located. I've been in correctional settings. And so kind of interestingly, in hindsight, now that I look back, veterans tend to be, these numbers are changing, but, on the whole tend to be men. I mean, that's the largest gender of the veterans, and corrections is the same way as well. So
Yeah.
in a way, I just kind of backed into working with men. That's largely been my kind of client population. But just identifying as a man myself, with the pandemic, as we mentioned, the pandemic, my life had kind of shifted in a way that really, I mean, not to sound like really dramatic about it, but it just really crumbled.
Yeah.
I was 40 and all the currents of life kind of caught up to me, and I was using substance uses in a very sophisticated way and other ways to distract myself from my life. And the pandemic sort of pushed that, and things kind of fell apart for me. And so that was my own personal gift, really, because it opened some things up for some stuff I had been running from for a long time, and gave me the opportunity to really turn towards it. So that's really where my passion for working with men is just having gone through that recovery process, a healing process, and having 20 years of this kind of skills and perspectives, and this is what I do. So just really applying what I do in my heart, and that's men's mental health. So
Yeah, I'm curious. Like, what is one thing that you had to let fade from your previous life, or something that you saw in the mirror during this COVID time? Because like you said, you're not alone in that. I think a lot of men and a lot of people in general, like, got that mirror held up to them.
yeah, I mean, and maybe as a segue into relational leadership, I mean, I think I just came into contact with the reality that I wasn't being a very good leader,
Yeah.
and I don't think I'm alone there. As men, and again, this is a sensitive, nuanced topic. So I just want to say this because I made a comment on the social media platform the other day, and I just got like railed at for using the wrong word. And it's nuanced, and so I might say things that are really generalized or specific or doesn't necessarily apply. But I guess I just want to name that.
For sure.
That this
Yeah.
is stuff. But um, a lot of men, I think, get socialized in a way that's kind of like, this is what it means to be a man. I had professional success, I had a family, I had a house, and I was professionally, by that definition of being a provider, I was like knocking it out of the park. But emotionally and relationally, I was really falling apart, and I didn't really even see it because of the conditions of my relationship, but also I think the larger culture sort of rewards that style, that kind of way of thinking about what success means, and less about maybe what we'll talk a little bit more about. So that's what I came into contact with. Basically, I wasn't doing a very good job from my own assessment, and I needed to make some changes.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the gifts of like the modern era, right, is I think men are being asked to expand into more things, right? Like, after feminism, which I think is a great movement, obviously, right? Like women were able to expand their roles into being providers. And now as men, we don't get that by default anymore, right? So I think like the people in our lives, specifically the women in our lives, are demanding more. They're demanding more of what you're talking about, more of that relational piece, more of that, emotional piece, more of that openness and vulnerability and caregiving. And I think it's given men, the first chance in a while to really show up and nurture, but nurture in a masculine way, not in a feminine way. I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I might use the word necessity. I think it's a
Yeah.
necessity that men sort of open up to the modern landscape, like this older version of masculinity, not all bad. I'm not an anti, I'm not anti-traditional masculinity, but I'm also pro modernization. We got to update the software here. And, the landscape of cultural landscape, technological landscape, like everything has really changed so quickly. And yet we still kind of operate on these old ways of thinking about like what relationships are and what gender are. And basically it's a misalignment, like it's no longer fit. And I think we see this in like some of the statistics, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, but like over 60% of males 18 to 30 are single. And, and half of them aren't even trying to be in a relationship.
Yeah.
And my sense is in conversations is, and talking with women, especially, they're kind of like, I don't need you, like, I don't need that extra burden.
Yeah.
Unless you're going to show up in my life, participate and be a leader, be a contributor. Like, it's too much work for me, like I don't. So I think for men to really live in fulfilling, engaging lives, it's kind of a necessity. We need to update the software, how we think about things.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think like it's all this emotional realm. And what I like to say to a lot of my clients, right, is like the frontier, right? The frontier for men is the inner space. It is doing this inner work because we haven't had to do it for a long time. And yeah, I like what you're saying. Like there is a blend of like traditional masculine roles. I think as men, we get fulfilled by a lot of those. But this idea of modern and this idea of consent, I think is critical in relationships, right? Of like, you can do whatever you want as long as you talk about it, right? As long as it's a consensual understanding, then the roles can be really different in relationship now, which I think for a lot of men spooks us, right? Because we're like, oh shit, I thought we had a playbook and we could just run the playbook, but now we have to actually take responsibility for ourselves and for our relationships.
Yeah. Yeah, and I see that in a lot of like my sort of midlife guys that I'm working with. They've done everything by the book, they've been successful, and then they look around and they're like, "What? But I'm disconnected, and I'm without direction." And I'm like, "Is this it?" Like there's something missing. I would just go back to the other thing I think is important is the and I loved your language around that, but like this inner work, right? Whether it's psychological or emotional, spiritual, whatever, the sort of inner work, I would say not only have we not had to do it for a long time, we've never really done it. And this there's a lot of research on this too. Like between 3, 4, 5 years of age, men really get separated from their internal experience. Like quit crying or I'll give you something to cry about, like in that kind of quit feeling sorry for yourself. Even if you have caregivers that were allowing of emotions, the larger culture doesn't want men to be vulnerable, period. Even if I love Brene Brown's work and it's right on. But the reality is men that are vulnerable pay consequences because of the masculine waters that we swim in. So for a lot of men that I work with, it's building emotional integrity, building an emotional vocabulary. It's kind of like beginning there because we weren't taught emotional skills. We weren't taught relational skills. And so, but we're trying to navigate really complex situations like relationships. So I often say men, and I would include myself in this category, it's like we're like kindergartners trying to do long division, like the world is demanding of us an ability to respond and be responsive and to be good leaders, but we don't have like a full toolbox, right? Like we didn't have all the everything that we need. So anyways, maybe I digress.
No, I think that's a really good point.
I'm about it honestly.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And I think it's worth also saying that like we don't live in like a therapy perfect world where like the Brene Brown fantasy, right? Like, oh, if you're just super vulnerable all the time, everyone's going to respect you and like follow you because they're going to see how courageous it is, right? I think for most men, it's just what you said, right? You get bullied, you get ostracized, you get viewed as weak. Like that's still very real. I think the culture is shifting and I'm happy for that, but it's not there. So I do think things like therapy and coaching are critical for guys because you can actually do it confidentially, honestly, right? And like work out and learn some of these skills in a safe environment so that you can then take it out into the world in maybe a more evolved form, you know?
And I think that like therapy or that sort of confidential, neutral relationship is huge for that, because it gives you a space to sort of explore what that is. What is vulnerability? What does that mean? What does it look like in my life? So you can work through that and then go out into the world and be brave and courageous and all those sort of ways. And as you have that courageous, you're more willing to be vulnerable, and that really shows up too, as you said, as it's changing. Same with men's spaces. I didn't sit with men at all until 4 years ago. And then I started sitting in men's groups, men's spaces, and there's a lot of them out there. And they're really powerful because I think that's where men can really reflect and see themselves in other men. And then they can sort of go out into their lives and as dads and husbands and partners and show up that way. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. We talked about that in an episode 2 back for the listeners, a lot about men's groups, right? And the power of just like getting that kind of like, oh yeah, me too. I also feel that, you know, getting held accountable by a council of men. And yeah, I'm so happy that that stuff seems to be on an upswing. I mean, I provide it, you provide it. I think it's really great that those are becoming a little bit more acceptable. Whereas it seems like for past generations, it wasn't, because again, it was all this like shallow, fragile, toxic masculinity of like, do not show anybody anything because they could stab you right in the heart.
Mm-hmm. And like you said, in some cases it can, right? But if you have like a known sort of container, you know, and these spaces are available, it's amazing to me every time I'm with a group of men, how powerful that is, you know, like how just to shine a light on some things. And all guys are always like, oh yeah, me too. Like that's my experience too. But when you live in isolation, you know, and you're the lone wolf, like you don't see that, right? It feels like you're all alone. So that connection is powerful.
Yeah, so I want to dig into our topic because I think we're talking about it, right? Which is relational leadership. So I'm curious for our listeners, if you could define what you mean by relational leadership and maybe contrast it to a more traditional style of leadership.
Yeah, I think relational, I mean, at its essence, relational leadership to me is really about creating conditions for others to shine, you know, to be at their best. So to think relationally is to think ecologically. And so I think there's also this sort of like shift in understanding that as relational leaders, we kind of take ownership for that system or that container. We understand that we're a part of that. You know, when I scream and yell, it impacts another person, right? You know, or if I empower them and lift them up, it's relational empowerment, you know? And so I think that's a shift away from more kind of individualistic power over versus power with ways of thinking about leadership. And I think that's certainly what I was taught, you know, that more masculine, authoritarian, top down, power over style of leadership. And that's not necessarily bad. In fact, like in war zones, it saves lives, you know, like there's certain context that is really useful form of relationship. But in your families around the dinner table, it starts to become problematic. You're not really elevating, you know, what's in it. Not, you know, for how can we help people really be at their best? So that's the big shift. It's kind of a power, you know, moving from power over to power with. It's coming along kind of shoulder to shoulder in taking in relationship. And then the other piece around masculinity, I think masculinity, again, for me, and strengths that allow, you know, one to care for and protect others. And so I think like the masculine energy, and this doesn't matter how you identify, everyone sort of has a certain amount of masculine energy, right?
Yep.
But it's coming from that place to make sure that people are in conditions, they're safe, they feel cared for, they feel empowered for them to really kind of grow and thrive.
Yeah, so it's that real like protector, defender energy. You know, one of the men's writers, Jack Donovan, talks about how masculine energy creates the perimeter and feminine energy builds the village, right? So it's like we're all about like who's in, who's out. Is it safe, right? Are there predators out there? Can we defend our perimeter? And then you need the feminine to actually make the village, make the perimeter something worth protecting, to like
Yeah.
really make it
Yeah.
grow and flourish. And I like what you said. Everybody has a combination of masculine and feminine. It's a spectrum in there. But I do think that protector defender is more to the root of masculine versus I think what you're talking about of like this like king tyrant energy, right? Which is like masculine, I guess, but also like almost a shadow version coming from a place of insecurity.
Yep. Or grandiosity. Yeah.
Yeah. Grandiosity, insecurity, or like wanting to dominate and control, right? Because oftentimes leaders feel imposter syndrome. So they just like lash out at somebody else.
Yep. Yeah. It's very self-absorbed, very individualistic, sort of short-term reactive energy. Yeah.
Yeah. So, what I think about this is, and we'll talk about this maybe more in our second segment, but is how important mindfulness is to this. And you mentioned that you are a
Mm.
mindfulness coach and practitioner as well. And it sounds like, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, but it's almost critical, right? You need to be mindful to be able to take that wider lens and to view more of what's going on and not to be stuck in your own head. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think it's crucial. I kind of focus on like five main pillars, and mindfulness is one of them. And
Hmm.
it to me, it's the skill of all skills. Everything is it's awareness. It's present moment, non-judgmental, non-reactive awareness.
Hmm.
And I think, yeah, to use like a computer analogy, like MS-DOS was really great in the
Hmm.
90s. It doesn't work anymore for the
Yeah.
complexity. And for me, I think about mindfulness as a platform for sort of updating. It's like as we get present to the present moment, we can observe and describe non-judgmentally, non-reactively what's going on, and that updates our map. Otherwise, we are wired to behave based on what's happened to us in the past, which is great if you're around a hot stove, right?
Hmm.
And you don't want to that's or crossing busy roads or something. It's not so great when you're in a relationship and you've been betrayed, right? Or you had a father that was really emotionally unavailable to you, right? Now you're operating on those old patterns, which are now getting in the way. So mindfulness is a platform for learning. It's like, oh, when I'm in a relationship, I treat it like a hot stove. I want to go
Hmm.
away. I want to withdraw. I want to shut down. And just through that awareness, now we have choice. It's like, oh, okay, well, that's I can choose. I can still shut down, but I could also choose not to, and I could just stay here and be in a relationship. And then, of course, you have a wonderful time and you connect, and then now you're updating your software. It's like not some people might be harmful, but not everybody is, right? So
Yeah. I think that's
I
really
think it's
well said.
crucial.
And critical for leadership, right? Because the idea is you need to be able to keep that that platform updating to go from this toxic authoritarian style to relational style. So we're gonna move to a commercial break. When we come back, I want to hear more about those five pillars, and listeners, you can get a chance to really dive into becoming a relational leader yourself. So hang on in there, and we'll see you on the other side. Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Mark Azulay, and I'm here with Donald Bialkowski, and we're talking about relational leadership. So, Donald, before we went off to our break, you mentioned that you have 5 pillars that you help educate leaders on how to develop this style. Do you mind going into those in more detail for us?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. It's an interesting, I think about the work that I do in my own work, personal work is really a maturation or an evolution, a development. And so often I start with clients just around leadership, like self-leadership, like really getting aligned with yourself. And so I usually use 5 pillars, and that the first one, so the pillars are mission, mindset, mindfulness, movement, and mentorship.
Okay.
And so just really briefly, so mission is just like, that's your direction. Like if you don't decide where you're going, you're bound to end up somewhere else. Just kind of get, so it's intentional, aligned action. What kind of man do you want to be? I want to be kind. I want to be responsive. I want to be a man of integrity. Like that becomes your direction. That's your directionality. So really important to kind of spend some time to clarify that. Mindset is really like who you are, how you think about yourself. It's sort of like, and I like to use the 4 characters in any story: the villain, the victim, the hero, and the guide. And usually, and we go through that progression just throughout our life cycle. Maybe not the villain so much, but maybe at times. But it's really, victims heal into heroes, and heroes, become guides. And so that mindset is like a hero's mindset is often where we want to make sure we're not in a victim mindset. Things are happening to me. Versus, things are happening for me. This is an opportunity for growth. So that's an important lens to make sure to develop around mindfulness, as we talked about. That's just self-awareness. Sometimes, growing up is less about learning new things and more about unlearning old things. And mindfulness really allows us to sort of like shed some of the things that are no longer working for us. Movement is really about body health, and like, your body keeps the score. If it's not performing well, neither are you. And I think we have to be especially intentional about it in today's modern world, where you can literally live your life from your couch. You do not need to move at all. So that's an important area of focus. And then mentorship, I talk about in terms of learning relationships. And I think mentorship, because of its history, is really like an old sage person telling a younger student. And to some degree that's true. But really, anybody can be our mentor if we have that sort of like understanding, that everybody is our teacher. Everybody has something to teach us. And relationships are the best personal development vehicles there are, So we can use our relationships to really help us learn about ourselves and help us learn about others.
Yeah, that's a really great framework. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, so that's sort of like, that's a focus of self-leadership. But as you get clear on that, you start developing, then relational leadership is kind of the same thing, just in relationship. What's the vision of our relationship? How do we want to be? That kind of clarification. Activities together, relational mindfulness. So it all sort of just kind of overlaps, whether I'm working with couples or I'm working individually.
That's awesome. That's really cool. I'm curious from those pillars, which do you see as like the hardest for guys to overcome or to implement into their lives? Like, are there any trends or patterns that you see in the people that you work with?
Yeah, I mean, I think the relational piece for sure, the mentorship piece, because of how we get socialized as men, it's really a disconnected one. So by far, that's the biggest piece. But it starts in this kind of relationship, and we can, a lot of men are actually doing it. They just don't really, so to shine a light on it and to kind of name it, I think is really helpful. And it doesn't seem like such a scary thing or something. But that's the one with men in particular that is the trickiest.
Yeah. Do you find that guys like struggle to ask for help and find mentors, or struggle to be mentors? Like which, or both maybe?
That's a great question. Definitely struggle to ask for help for sure. That's a major barrier. I think, and I think because of, it's kind of a chicken or the egg thing for a lot of men, because we don't reach out and be vulnerable. I mean, connection is where vulnerability is. And because we're not willing to be vulnerable, we really are pretty disconnected, even if we're, like you're alone in a crowd kind of thing, right? Like we don't, or our relationships are housed in like a work setting where there's a role and there's barriers. They're not wide open kind of vulnerability. So I think a lot of men then don't have those skills. So they often struggle with being a good mentor as well, because if it's authentic, it's vulnerable. And so that has to be an important piece. But that's related to the mindfulness piece as well.
Yeah, I think they're all interconnected, right? And like the mindset
Yeah.
piece, right? Because I think if you're in a victim mindset, you can't be a mentor, right? Or the mentorship you're going to
Yeah.
give is just like reinforcing victim mindset, right? Being like, oh yeah, that asshole there, that's the problem. It's not you, right? Like you got to just, it's the government or whatever, right? It's your boss, just like creating that kind of like bitterness that I see a lot of men have, which I've always found kind of interesting, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, right? Because I think traditional masculinity and toxic masculinity in some ways too has this like idea of individualization, right? You have to like do it all by yourself, never ask for help, don't find mentors. It
Yeah.
means you're weak. You're going to be submissive to somebody. But then a lot of the guys who start working with me, honestly, are in that victim mentality. I think a lot of guys are stuck there. And those things seem at odds, because how can you be this like individual hero, right? This like individual lone wolf, but then feel like you're fighting the world and the world is winning. I'm curious if you see that interplay in your work.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that happens because of the disconnection,
Yeah.
because of the isolation, that men are really, they don't have that image to reflect off. You can reflect off things, but it's like looking at Polaroid pictures all over, without the intimacy. It's not a genuine or a more authentic, a more intimate sort of reflection.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that makes sense, but
It does. Yeah.
so then that creates distance, and then that gets interpreted as, oh, look, them versus me. It sort of sets up this sort of separation. And that's really like victim is a tough word, because there's a lot of connotations, and there's certainly people that are victims. But I like to talk about victim stance, or as just like things, whether things are happening externally to you, right? Or you have an internal locus of control, which is like still the same thing. It's still raining outside, but I'm not a victim to the rain. I'm going to go outside and like have fun in the rain, right? And that comes from an internal place. But if men haven't developed that, it's like a victimization is like a earlier in the process, it's the sapling, but it's like, so we really need other guides. We need other relationships to help us grow out of that and to feel connected. And that's a missing piece. So we kind of stay stuck in this. But then we hear these stories of like Rocky Balboa and Superman and all these heroes. And that's how it fits together. It's like, that's how I should be, but this is how I feel, which is really isolated, and like things are out of my control.
Right. Yeah. I mean, what I'm hearing is like a lot of guys are like fronting the hero, but they haven't really integrated the hero. They're acting like Superman until they can't, right? Until it falls apart.
Mhm.
But they don't have that intimacy and that connection and that realness. And I think ultimately, what else are you talking about is like taking responsibility for your life. Even the things that are out of your control, you can still take responsibility for how you deal with them, how you, manage them, how you respond to them. Like there's power to be gained everywhere, versus just, I think, feeling victimized by the world.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Having agency. I think it was Goff that said I think the quote is, in the book of your life, you don't have any control over the story, just your character. And then it's sort of like having that understanding, that agency, that no matter how this thing goes. And I deal a lot with this when I first meet with men that are, going through infidelity, or they're a divorce, or they lost, job loss or something, right? It's like, well, you don't have any control over the story, but you do have control over how it goes, and at the end of it, you can feel good about how you made decisions, how you engaged, how you turned towards, whatever hardship that you're facing.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's critical for a leader. I mean, as you were talking earlier, and we talked about a little bit of this during the break, is like this idea of shifting from leading through fear to leading through respect. And, one of my clients actually talked about this a couple of weeks ago, where he said that, the most masculine form of love for him is respect, and I had never really thought of it that way, that respect is a form of love. And there is something there, right? Because I think it's a way that we give and show love in maybe more traditional masculine, framework. But I'm curious, like, how do you help people make that pivot? Because my sense is that leading from fear works really well in the short term, right? But leading from respect is much more of a long-term game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, often just by holding up the mirror,
Hmm.
I mean, the question is like, you decide, I don't know. You're a complex, dynamic, changing human being.
Yeah.
I have no idea, but like, how well is it working?
Hmm.
Like how well is that style of leadership in terms of the time you spend with your kids? Like, how do your kids look at you? What would you want your kids to say,
Hmm.
And or sometimes I'll do some like different exercises, visualization exercises around values clarification, and because really, I mean, with the except, I'm sure there's an exception with some people, of course, but like the vast majority of men want to be great men. They want to be men of integrity. They want to be great leaders. They want to have success and accomplishment and all those things. And that's all possible. But getting there isn't just forcing it through, right? And maybe at times it is, but that's just the question, is helping, teaching men, giving them the skills or the vehicle, the scaffolding so that they can be honest with themselves. Like, okay, telling, yelling at my partner, is that moving me closer to or further away from
Hmm.
the man that I want to be? Like, you decide. If it's closer to, do it. If it's further away, I would invite you to consider something else, like maybe an alternative in that situation. Take a breath, walk away, whatever, in this case of conflict. But
Yeah.
so yeah, I think that's what I try to do, is
Hmm.
just really empower men to sort of be honest with themselves and really sort of, again, mindfulness, just observe, describe, non-judgmentally.
Hmm.
What happened? I yell. What happens around me? What's the impact of that?
Yeah, it makes me think of
You're the
the
scientist in science experiment.
the Marcus Aurelius quote, which is "the soil doesn't lie," right? And he talks
Mm.
about men getting hobby. For him, it was like gardening or like digging ditches, right? But like having something where you get 100% honest feedback, right? The soil doesn't lie. If you suck at gardening, your plants are not going to grow, and there's no way
Yes.
you can like over rationalize why they're not growing. Like either they're growing or they're not. And
Mhm.
I'm curious for you, like, how do you get guys to take in feedback? Because I know so much of us are so defensive, or like you said before, victim mentality, or almost like gaslighting sometimes, right? Like I think for whatever reason, I'm curious if you have any ideas about the why behind it, but it seems like a lot of modern men are really afraid to look in the mirror.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that's changing.
Yeah.
I think the guys that end up coming to this process have some willingness,
Hmm.
and they're still, so honestly, I was just having this conversation. This guy got it, wanted to get confrontational, and like, I just don't have time for that anymore. And like, you're not ready then, like if you want to continue to live that way, then, like I'm not gonna like save every man everywhere or anything like that. Like I'm just a resource. Um, I think elevating with mindfulness, the values clarification, like you tell me what's important to you, so I know.
Hmm.
And then the mindfulness thing of just getting curious about like how you're reacting. And as you hold those two things together, um, willingness happens there because we're motivated to really be healthy and well and have deep relationships and have connecting relationships. Is sort of like built in. So basically just leveraging, just like a tree will grow towards the sun, just leverage human growth and development in a way that is non-judgmental, non-confrontational. It's really, for me, a lot of this work, whether it's coaching or mentorship or therapy or couples work, is really it's really about, I just lost my train of thought. It's really about just like the interactive dialogue. I know as a man for a
Hmm.
long time I lied to myself about how it was
Hmm.
going, and I say this weekly. Like you're too close to yourself
Yeah.
to really sort of get it done. So like this process of just reflecting back on other people can be really valuable, and just that in and of itself.
Yeah. And I imagine to extend the thought, it's critical as a leader, right, to have that mirror from your employees.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's all over the place, this
Hmm.
sort of style of leadership, and just it's just human interaction a little
Hmm.
bit, but um, yeah, it can be quite complicated when it gets a little bit more intimate and we get into relationships that are deeper and more connecting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think like, creating as many avenues for feedback as possible. Because for me, that's such a masculine quality, right? Is like dealing with reality as it is, you know,
Yeah.
whether it's us, whether it's the truth of our business, whether it's the truth of our family. But I think like being a truth hunter and a truth seeker is critical to the masculine pursuit, right? Like we need to see the world as it is without filter so that we can be the most effective man we can be. So
Hmm.
I imagine, I mean, a lot of the work that I do, and I imagine a lot of the work that you do is like just stripping away that filter, one layer at a time to be like, hey, this is what's really happening. Like, are you ready? You ready to accept it? You ready to see that now?
That's it. I love your Marcus Aurelius quote. I never heard that, but that's it. The dirt doesn't lie. So just it's that simple, fundamental. It's just getting that feedback from your environment.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're going to move to our next commercial break. When we come back, we're going to talk about some steps that our listeners might take to start practicing this relational style, bring it into their places of leadership, whether that be as a father, as a business owner, as a team leader, whatever it is. So Donald, thank you so much. And we'll see you on the other side of the commercial break.
Great.
Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Mark Azulay, and we're sitting here with Donald and we're talking about relational leadership. So, Donald, for our listeners, like if they want to get started on working on these 5 pillars, or they want to get started being more vulnerable, being more honest, taking in feedback, where's a good place to start?
Yeah, well, as we were talking, I was reflecting. I had read a book not see, a couple of years ago. Maybe it's called Radical Honesty. It's
Hmm.
written by Brad Blanton. He was a psychotherapist. I think it was written in the '90s, so maybe it's not the most current book, but that's a great resource as a place
Hmm.
to again sort of create this filter and define feedback and what that looks like, and getting a little bit more honest with yourself. Um, yeah, and in terms of the 5 pillars, so mindfulness, there's a ton of mindfulness resources that are out there. Calm, Headspace. There's a number of those. I would also say one thing. Teaching mindfulness for many years, there's a lot of misconception around mindfulness being like mind clearing or some sort
Hmm.
of tool to manage or control, be more relaxed, more peaceful. That's called relaxation, and it's really great. Mindfulness is not, falling asleep or relaxing, it's falling awake, it's paying attention. And so it's a state of awareness. So that's a nuance, it's subtle, but it's a seismic sort of shift around intention of the practice. We want to just notice what our experience is moment to moment. So with that being said, like mindfulness is a great place to start. I would invite people to do therapy, try coaching if you haven't done it, find a men's group. These are all just interactive dialogue, relational ways, that fifth pillar of mentorship and approaching your relationship as learning opportunities. And the thing I often almost always start with when I work with clients is get clear on who you want to be, like what your values are. And there's a ton of resources online. Even a mission statement is useful, but something that becomes a formula for decision making is we usually make decisions based on managing how we think and feel. And that's okay, but it's not in your best interest. Your mind isn't always your friend. So getting clear, like, oh, I want new experiences or creativity or spirituality. These are important things to me, and that's what I'm going to make my decisions on. So some kind of values clarification exercise, I would highly recommend, is a good place to start and revisit from time to time. So
Yeah, I think that's absolutely critical, right? Because in the modern world, we have to create our own purpose and our own meaning, and it's not prescribed. And I think a lot of the guys that are drawn to therapy in some ways are nonconformist, right, or anti-authority. So they're not just going to like take a meaning wholesale. They need to make it themselves. And I think it's difficult for a lot of guys, right? Or I think it's difficult to sometimes pick a value on one of those values exercises. It's like, well, this isn't like a traditional masculine value. It's something that is really important and meaningful to me. I'm wondering if you notice that with your clients. Like, do they struggle when it comes to narrowing down their values?
Yeah, I mean, I think yes. And I think the word, values, I mean, it helps to have some discussion about like what that is, what values are, like what's their nature, that kind of thing. But I think once, if guys are willing to sort of do it, go through some kind of, even I have a worksheet, right? Just like look at these values, like which ones stand out to you. Or another great way to identify your values is thinking about what's not going well. What are you dissatisfied in your life? Let's say I'm disconnected, I'm lonely. Flip that upside down. The opposite is connection, right? Like, so you can find your values by turning your dissatisfaction upside down. Or looking to other people. This is helpful for me. I often like Martin Luther King Jr., for example, is he's a vision for me, and I can call him to mind, like, those are my values. Like, that's something that I aspire to. So people in your life that inspire you are good places to find your values too.
Yeah, I like that a lot, right? And it's like really deconstructing why you revere and honor these other people can be really helpful in clarifying. I also like, I know you didn't mention it in the beginning, but like I like your movement pillar. I think that's critical for guys. I think especially, young men, a lot of us are focused around like physical prowess and, being strong and fit and whatever, right? And while that stuff I do think is important, I think also what it takes to get there builds a lot of masculine values. It builds things like discipline. It builds things like mindfulness. It builds things like, commitment. It builds things like, overcoming challenge, like when you don't want to go to the gym and you got to do it anyway. Like nobody really likes going to the gym or like tracking calories or, installing a new exercise routine. Like all that stuff is tough. But I do think like when the motivation runs out, which it does for everybody, it's all about habits, right? It's all about like those discipline and commitment things. And for most guys, I think like mastering their body is a great, kind of tool set and a great canvas to work on that.
Yeah, that's great. I think that the five pillars that I use, and this isn't unique to me and sort of my system, but they are interrelated. And just to tie those values and mindfulness is like, once you clarify what's important, like health is important to you, like once you start like crafting that narrative that I'm healthy and you run a marathon or whatever, you don't have to worry about discipline,
right?
Of getting to the gym, like, what I mean? You're moving, you make movement part of everything, becomes aligned. Everything is moving in that direction. It's refined and aligned. You don't have to fight whether you got to go or, oh, I hate the gym or it's rain, that like that whole exhausting battle with yourself that you're not going to win, so just like create conditions for you to be successful. And Yeah. And I think you can't just do it. So if it's just go to the gym, go to the gym, go to the gym, you're not going to do it. You'll get bored. There's a billion reasons why you're not. But once you couch that into the larger context of what kind of man are you? Who are you? What are your goals? What are your aspirations? Then you don't have those conversations anymore. You sort of make them obsolete.
Right. Yeah. Like going to the gym becomes self-expression in a way. It doesn't become like
Yeah.
a chore. It's
Love
like,
that.
oh, this is me or being the man or person I want to be. I'm curious for you, like, let's fast forward, right? What does the modern man look like, right? Say they nail these five pillars, they become a relational leader. How are they operating in the world? Like, what's the hope that these guys can move forward towards?
Yeah. I mean, to be defined by each individual, as we've been talking, it's kind of unique. I was thinking too, sometimes I talk about like writing your own, these five pillars is like your own owner's manual,
Hmm.
like you consult it, it's yours, you build it, you write it. But the relational leaders, as um, I would say, have more peace, more contentment, more fulfillment. There's less energy in the sort of like chasing and striving and sort of like managing and controlling this fear-based living, because as you develop as a relational leader, you develop this confidence, you develop clarity, and fear isn't something that you have to manage. It actually becomes what fuels your movement, and you become more clear. Emotions aren't bad. They're actually energy, right? And you start to reframe everything is that mindset. And now we're using our inner experience to really drive us in directions that are meaningful and important. And as you're doing that, you're ending up in places that are more fulfilling. They're more connected. Your health is better. Your creativity is strong. Spirituality, like, so you're sort of building all those things, and that leads to fulfillment, it leads to happiness and peace and contentment.
Yeah, I mean that's a great vision, right? It's like I'm just hearing the word alignment just keeps coming to mind. Like everything is just like aligned, everything's in a row, everything is like feeding off of each other and creating this
Yeah.
kind of positive feedback loop.
Yeah, aligned on purpose. That's my deal. Like,
Yeah.
just being intentional, crafting that and really being intentional about bringing these things and overlaying and lining them up. That's where it's at, like misalignment is a big reason why we're dissatisfied.
Yeah.
So I just real quickly, like if honesty is important to you and you lie, then you feel crappy about it. You don't feel good, and then like 2 weeks later, you got a mess on your hands because you don't know who you lied to and whatever, like all that's brought to you by this misalignment. So if family, connection, art, creativity, if these things are important to you and you're not actively moving your hands and feet, you are unknowingly creating suffering in your life, right? So the opposite then is the idea is like if honesty is important to me, I'm gonna say what's on my mind, and I feel good about that. I feel solid. I might have some emotions around that, but I feel solid, and that builds opportunities when people need somebody they can trust because now I'm that person, right? And now you've created that opportunity for yourself. So it's moving that snowball, spinning that in the other direction of health and growth.
Yeah. Yeah. What was coming to mind is that is something that I say to my clients too, which is like, I'm not going to tell you who you have to be, but you have to be somebody. And I work with a lot of guys in like nice guy syndrome where they're chameleons. They're not really taking stands on things. Like you said, they're not committing to honesty or to creativity or to art or whatever. And it's because they're afraid and because they've been conditioned that way and it's not their fault. But it is this thing where I think there's so many men that feel really faceless in society and they feel like they're not unique and they're just like part of the crowd. And when I hear you talk about, refining, I mean, self-actualization, really, right? Like that's where belonging comes from. Because like you said, you become the vessel for honesty. You become, the mentor for fitness, or you become like the leader that people respect. There's like the sense of belonging that is, I think, on the other side of this work. Because, to listeners out there, like if you're trying to be everything for everybody, you end up being nobody for nobody. And I think that's upsets a lot of guys because we try really hard to be everything for everybody, but you can't really do that.
Yeah, I love that you said that his face, like that came up earlier. We
Yeah.
were talking like the idea of the mask, right? It's
Hmm.
so exhausting to have that mask and to live in this sort of like disconnected world. But to bring that together, there's a gap there, and that's what this work is really all about. But I would also say this: I love that you said belonging because when I meet with guys, no matter where they're at in a process of refining or self-actualization, if you boil down why they're doing it, it's about connection. Why do you you want to get rid of your anxiety so you can go out more? Why do you want to go out more so you can be with people? If you keep asking why do you want that thing out of your life, it boils down to connection. It's just a basic human thing, right? And belonging. So I agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's what a lot of men are lacking is community. So just, another plug for men's groups and working with coaches and mentors is I think we need community. I think we are so unbelievably isolated. Like you said, you can live your whole life from your couch. You can order everything off Amazon. You can work from home. You can just watch all the content on Netflix to your heart's desire. It's so easy and in many ways, validated, I guess. And we're moved towards being more isolated in the world for the sake of convenience. Right. But sometimes life should be inconvenient. You should need help. Right. And have to call on your friends and neighbors. I think that's what creates, or what has always created community in the past,
Yeah, we're actually wired that way. It's just energy conservation. It's easier to sit on the couch. So we got to move from thoughts and feelings to values, what's important to us, and create conditions for that. We got to be intentional about it. It's like 50 years ago or 70, we didn't have gyms because our lives were really movement. Now we got 24-hour fitness and stuff or whatever, and same thing with our emotional inner lives. We need to be more intentional about it. We need to create conditions that we can be connected.
Yeah.
We won't.
I always find that so interesting, right? Of so much of human history has been about creating ease and creating safety. And we did it. We actually accomplished the task. That now it's about finding challenge and finding danger. Because it turns out we needed that too, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's how it goes. It's upside down now. Yeah.
Yeah, well, this is a great conversation, Donald. I'm curious as we're wrapping up, if you want to work with you, where can they find you online and learn more about you and what you do?
Yeah, I think I saw in your show notes, my website is there. You can connect with me, my website, follow my newsletter. I do a weekly, just super brief tips and tricks and perspective. Nothing small bite-sized things. I'm on social media. You can follow things that I post from time to time. But just really, connect. And if not me, someone else. All the men that are out there, take the leap, take a risk, give it a shot, find some of these resources, and then you decide whether it's going to be helpful for you or not. But I'm happy to talk to guys, even if it's a brief conversation about what you want to do next, therapy, coaching, couples, whatever. And again, if it's not with me, we can find you somebody else.
Awesome. You're a wonderful resource for a lot of guys out there. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah, you too. Thank you, Mark.
And if you're a listener and you want to learn more about us, you can check us out at menstherapypodcast.com. We have a video version of this interview. You can check us out on YouTube, the website menstherapy.online. We have retreats coming up this year, 2 backpacking and 1 psychodrama. And then we also have some really great men's groups that are recruiting. And we have a book club that we launched. So check everything out. Everything is on menstherapy.online or menstherapypodcast.com. So listeners, thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week, another episode of the Men's Therapy Podcast.